Lend your ears, lend your hands, lend your movement, anything you can. Come to teach, come to be taught, come in the likeness and the image of God. 'Cause you can be like that, with all that humbleness and all that respect.
I want to introduce you now to another lovely chap. This guy helped set up the Occupy movement here in Queensland. He's very hard-working. He spent a lot of time at Bentley, and he's a very humble, beautiful man. Paul Seils.
Thank you. I want to share a little bit around my journey, about what happened for me. Part of my purpose is really to bring truth and love together. And my journey around truth, I woke up when 9/11 happened. And there was a difference of energy between what I was being told and what I felt. And that's where the separation started. It's been interesting. I grew up in a well, first couple of years of my life, I was the only white child in a Indigenous community in Northern Territory, and then moved back down towards Brisbane and down towards Beaudesert, and we grew up in a really rural or an insular environment where I went to state school with 30 children in one classroom from grade 1 to grade 7. I took my horse to school for show and tell. So it was beautiful, and the rest of the world didn't even exist. Then got into the landscape industry and being involved with plants and that sort of thing. And that set me off on a journey into the Middle East. And it's interesting because I met Ian for the first time about 2 years ago, but there's a synchronicity that occurred that my presentation somehow dovetails and interfaces what he's saying and brings some of the local knowledge into play as well. I did an 8-year stint in Dubai in the Middle East. We did a joint venture with the James Packer Company and created the second largest landscape consultancy in the Middle East with 65 staff, and worked on a lot of the projects there. So it was an interesting time to see what happened. It was brilliant from our industry point of view because we got to be involved with some of the big projects like the World, the Palm Island, the Sheikh's Palaces project, that sort of thing. This is some of the projects that we were involved with, some of our work, which was an interesting time. I got to see the GFC coming like a slow motion car crash because I followed a lot of the independent media that was coming through, and they were making noises around what was happening, and there's a lot of information there that's covered in documentaries like Zeitgeist Addendum, where the financial system's deliberately engineered and contracted and expanded and contracted. So it becomes like a game of musical chairs where there's just not enough money and flow to make it happen. The interesting thing was that when I was there, I got to meet a lot of people. And one of the people that I got to meet, that's one of the Sheikh's Palaces that I worked on. One of the people that I got to meet was this guy. This guy is this guy's brother. That's Tariq bin Laden. And this guy also has a lot of other titles as well that I wasn't aware of at the time, including World Hide and Seek Champion 2001 to 2011. There's a lot of Ks, I guess. But so I got to meet a lot of people there that knew a lot of really interesting stuff. Robert Fisk met bin Laden, and he wrote this article in '93 that talks about bin Laden and how bin Laden was used. He was a CIA asset. His name in English was Tim Osman, and he was used by Brzezinski, who's the guy that's now behind Obama, with his intelligence to fight the Russians in an agenda to try and break down the Soviet state. Bin Laden was treated for kidney dialysis in July 2001, and it's well documented. It's covered in a lot of stories, articles, books, and it's my personal belief that he probably died a couple of years later, but there was an agenda there. And we were given bits and pieces of information that we were told that this is what's happened. We were given animated cartoons that sort of showed us this is what transpired. and showed photos that said, look, he's dead, he's gone, you know. And that was like what Ian's talking about, is touching on the agenda to roll out this legislation, the Patriot Act. And then, of course, we were told that he was buried at sea, which is not a Muslim tradition whatsoever. Buried at sea, no evidence whatsoever, and we had to dispose of the body out of respect. So the most wanted man in the world, no evidence whatsoever. End of 2002, I found this book by Pitt and also written with Scott Ritter. Scott Ritter was the former UN weapons inspector that was involved with, and he outlines in this book how Iraq could not have any weapons of mass destruction because they had destroyed them all previously, or they had expired, their shelf life had expired, or that the US had technology for surveillance to even be able to see a packet of cigarettes on the ground and be able to tell what brand of cigarettes it is. So they knew quite well what they were doing. It was a difficult time for me to be there and just experience what was happening, and also be aware of what was being fed to Australia in relation to propaganda. This is the story about Fallujah, the Battle of Fallujah that occurred, and it was probably it was very intense. They labelled anyone that's against the occupation as being insurgents and indirectly terrorists, but in Fallujah it's not very well known that they had twice the radiation levels of depleted uranium, twice the radiation levels of Hiroshima. And I'm just going to show you the next slide. If you're a little bit sensitive to visual things, I'd encourage you to probably look away for this next slide. This shows some of the birth defects and, yeah, depleted uranium used on the people, against the people. And the irony of it is the fact, of course, in hindsight, is they didn't have any weapons of mass destruction, but they had it used against them with depleted uranium and white phosphorus. This guy says, I have absolutely no regrets. And this guy, Donald Rumsfeld, when he was asked, where is the weapons of mass destruction? His comment was, they're in the north, south, east, west region. I don't know whether you remember that at all. I want to touch on this quickly as well, because this is important too. This, if you look at the, where's my pointer? Yeah. Well, 2001. Basically, the Taliban outlaws opium production. And then since the US occupation with the coalition of the willing, the opium and heroin production has just gone through the roof. This is a recent article, last 12 months, all-time high, best ever. So, yeah. I just want to point out the fact as well that the CIA is also complicit in being involved with the administration and running of drugs, arms, and rendition of prisoners all over the world. Mexican official, CIA manages drug trade. There's plenty of information out there. I just want to flag some things for you to do some research. People go, well, CIA is not really involved in Australia. And 72 to 75? Australia was free. A lot of people don't know this. John Pilger wrote this amazing article. John Pilger is an amazing Australian international journalist, and he produced the documentary Utopia as well, if any of you have seen that, if you get a chance to have a watch that online. But yeah, CIA being involved with the coup over Whitlam. Robert Fisk, he wrote this book, the 1,500-page The Great War for Civilization. And it's an epic book. The Great War for Civilization was a medal that was dedicated to his father for his services to the First World War. So I thought I'd come out and get involved in my early activism stuff, and I'd publish a book as well called Everything George W. Bush and the US government knows about diplomacy. And got a half-page write-up in the Gulf News in the Middle East. And the irony of it was blank. It was a blank book. People thought it was amazing. It's like, I get publishers and bookstores ring me and they'd said, I think we've got a misprint. This book doesn't have anything inside it. So, what do you know? So I got to meet Robert Fisk. Amazing guy. Like I said, 1,500 pages, that's me holding it in his hand, and I gave him a copy of my book that was written by my alias called Dick Pullen. And I wrote on the inside of it for him, less is more, and I handed it to him. He thought that was funny. I want to talk to you about PSYOPs, psychological operations. If you've ever believed that any conflict that any country or any of us have been involved with has been justified, you've been subject to a PSYOPs. Psychological operations are involved with an externalisation of threat with an agenda. The people can always be brought to the bidding of the leaders. That is easy. All you have to do is tell them they are being attacked and denounce the pacifists for lack of patriotism and exposing the country to danger. It works the way in any country. Ian touched on this before as well. I think that speaks for itself. More articles there in relation to ISIS being armed and even food drops, etc. Syria. But this is the same pattern. If you watch it, there's the same pattern that goes over and over again. UN sanctions, try to overthrow countries from within, destabilisation, arm the rebels, run propaganda campaigns on both sides. So they've equally had PSYOPs carried out against them as well, telling them that, you know, infidels are coming and rah, rah, rah. And so there's a number of people coming out and being openly outspoken. And as Ian touched on, ISIL, what they call, was it Islamic State, ISIL, ISIS, so on and so forth, as it's just being rebranded because Al-Qaeda is the, in English, the base, the database. So that's the Al-Qaeda is just the English name for the CIA's database of all their assets. Here's a photo with, what is he now, Vice President? US Senator John McCain, Vice President of the US. Yeah. So he's having a cup of tea. Having a cup of tea with ISIS. Bit of diplomacy. This is even more terrifying. ISIS releases a snippet of song and threatens to release the whole song if their demands are not met. This is how you remind me of what I really am. Poor old Nickelback. My brother sent me that from the States. This is the demonisation. This is to show you the reflection of the demonisation, because even the old people are getting terrified. Everyone's getting terrified. They're terrifying the pensioners. The Muslims are coming to take over your country. There's a representation there of Australia that they're saying that we estimate that the Muslim population is about 20%. In reality, it's only about 2%. If you get a chance, Ian touched also on Bali. If you get a chance, watch this documentary. It's amazing. There's a young guy called Glenn Clancy who put this documentary together called Fool Me Twice. Young Australian guy based out of Melbourne. He lives in Asia now. He was involved with a lot of the work on the Hungry Beast show that was on the ABC, I think it was. It was a great show when it was on. And he goes into massive details. It's about 2 hours long, and he talks about all the information that was a lead up in relation to Bali and the research around how it couldn't be a false flag, the technology that was used, the craters that were formed, all that sort of information. But what happened after that is that the sedition laws were brought in Australia, and sedition basically means being outspoken against the government. And they put a sunset clause into the legislation that's due to expire in November 2015. So what we've had is the recent turn of events that's come about, where they had 800 police carry out a massive operation. Well, what they did prior to that is they, for the first time in the history of Australia, they elevated the threats, the potential threat of terror, of an act of terror occurring to high without any evidence. Then they carried out the raids, 800 pleas, with only one charge of a 22-year-old being charged based on a phone call to a person that was killed a couple of weeks ago somewhere in the Middle East. He's had no access to any legal representation or visitation rights for family in that time frame. So we had all this splashed across the media, including this image, which was a plastic sword for decoration. I'm going to come down here because I can't see it probably from up the screen. But if you look at this, while the Ebola stuff was coming out, here we go. Surveillance under the name of counter-terrorism, as well as giving states new tools to crack down on dissent by simply labelling activists terrorists. Who can see where this is going? This is it's on the UN website in relation to terrorism. 24th of September 2014. You can read that, that's up there. About the act, so enforcing basically the Global Patriot Act. Jihadist passport removal to stay. So what they've done the same with the bikie laws in Queensland is getting rolled out on a national level, where they're saying that if you're classified as a low-level terrorist, activist, we have the right to remove your passport and remove any government benefits. Andrew Wilkie. There was only three politicians that were outspoken against it. So you've always got to be suspicious when it gets pre-elevated, it's carried out, the legislation's drafted, ready to go, and it's rolled out with politicians only given about 30 minutes to read an act before it's passed. So what they're doing in effect is the Bali legislation is about to expire, so they're bringing in the new legislation to override it without any sunset clause. This is in Russia, RT, Russia Today, calling Australian laws and draconian. Russia calling Australia's laws draconian. I thought that was interesting. So these are some of the new powers. Power to access and modify or copy or delete data on your personal computer. Jail journalists for national security reporting and offences. National reporting, yeah. As if we don't have enough tabloid journalism as it is already. Offences for disclosing sensitive information, including whistleblowers and journos. So the thing is that keeps getting trotted out as well, is that people are saying, if you are not doing anything wrong, you have nothing to hide. But why aren't we putting the onus of responsibility and the burden of proof back on the government to say, if you're doing anything wrong, why can't everyone be a whistleblower? What have you got to hide? What is metadata? This is the other part of it as well that's really interesting. What is metadata? I didn't really know what was metadata. Metadata is basically when people like Barack Obama and Julie Bishop come out and say, we're not listening to your phone calls. That's correct, technically. They're not listening, but it's all fully logged. Who you call, when you call, how long you call, which numbers you call, which numbers you text, who you email. It's all logged. It's being logged. They're just bringing the act now to make it legal, to use that as evidence.
You saw it in President Obama. We're not listening to your phone calls. We're not listening to the content. We're just collecting the metadata, which means who you called, when you called them, how often you called them, how long you talked for. That's all we're collecting, just the metadata. So you shouldn't need to worry about it. Well, you know, I take my cue from a former general counsel of the NSA, Stuart Baker, who said on this question, metadata absolutely tells you everything about somebody's life. If you have enough metadata, you don't really need content. It's sort of embarrassing how predictable we are as human beings. And that's the thing is, you know, with metadata, they can know when you called your girlfriend, when you called your ex-girlfriend, when you called your parents, when you called your children, when you called Alcoholics Anonymous, when you called a drug rehab center, when you called your drug dealer, when you called your political party. They know all of that. They can connect up. Who are your closest friends? Who are you most closely associated with? Who do you talk to all the time? Who do you talk to only sometimes? That's a tremendous amount of information that they can get. And we got it from General Counsel of the NSA himself. We don't even need content if we can get metadata. And let me just add, the program that we've all been talking about is a phone metadata program. But the law under which the NSA gathered this is not a law that limits to phone company and phone data. It's a law that allows the government to get any business records on anybody, and in their interpretation, literally anybody and everybody. And so they could get email records, who you've emailed, who's emailing you, what websites you're searching, what searches you put into Google. All of that goes to businesses, which then have those records, and under the NSA's theory of how American law should run, they can get any and all of that information, because it might happen that at some point, some of it might be useful to try to find a terrorist. To me, that's dragnet surveillance at its worst, and the distinction between content and metadata really is erased.
Is erased. And this is all done under the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, and the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court is the secret court that weighs, as I said, in secret, the legal justification for putting together a search of metadata linked to a person or persons, and then gives it an okay or a not okay, and it is on a time limit. General Hayden, you can find out all these things David just said about me, about David, about anyone in this audience. That is a function of operational capability. I'd like you to talk about whether you're comfortable with that operational capability. If so, why? And how often is it used in the ways that David described?
Yeah, first of all, David's description of what you can do with metadata, and quoting a mutual friend, Stuart Baker, is absolutely correct. Okay? We kill people based on metadata.
Former CIA director. We kill people based on metadata. I'm not trying to add into all the alarmism, but these guys are just being blatant now. Abbott brings on mandatory retention in Australia. There was a couple of points here I want to pick out. Yeah, look at this. Second tranche. Let me get this to drive. Including broadening of definition of terrorism, including supporting and promoting terrorism. So you lent 20 bucks to your mate, go and buy his lunch. He goes down, decides to pick up a placard to protest. Next thing you know, you supported him. Why is this other bit here as well? In relation to the metadata, where are we? One company, INET, has estimated the cost of developing such a system would cost the company $100 million in the first 2 years. So it's going to be another form of indirect taxation. Hungary's going off about, they're getting charged, like they're going to be charged per gigabyte to use the internet. So those companies are going to have to pass those costs on to consumers. Global surveillance, that's been brought on with and highlighted by people like Edward Snowden. This is how the PRISM system works, PRISM, P-R-I-S-M-I-N. And that's just the metadata interface there. So I can't even profess to understand or advise about how that works, but there's plenty of information there to find how that happens. And then there's other websites like Prison Break to give you information about how to download apps for your phone and also software solutions, including what's going to happen is there's going to be a massive boom in privacy technology, because I don't promote anything that's illegal, but I don't think that we don't have a, you know, we shouldn't be surveilled, we shouldn't give away our privacy unnecessarily. If you see something, say something. No, I'm saying something. I want to touch quickly on Occupy, because I know there's been a few people who are here. These are my friends like Thomas and Angela and people like that. I want to touch on this quickly, because this was really interesting. People said Occupy didn't achieve anything. Well, it technically wasn't meant to. It was meant to be a reflection of the world awakening. And it was the first time in the history of the world that nearly 2,000 cities at a time gathered to say, hey, we're waking up. Yeah, this is us. There's Thomas Brooks in the back, Kasia, Ryan Seaton. The media basically dismissed us as a bunch of ratbags, but 3 of us that were involved with the startup in Brisbane were directors of companies. Democracy is becoming corporatocracy. As Alex touched on earlier, it was beautiful to have Alex to come and do the opening today. Richest 1% now and half of the global wealth. That's like from last month. I wanted to point this out quickly as well. This is really interesting. US Federal Reserve is a private corporation, yet the NAB and Westpac banks had to borrow money from them to survive. And how fractional reserve banking works through multiplication, how people need to have to borrow money is beyond my comprehension. Around the G20, it was really interesting to see Christine Lagarde from the IMF was here, just walking over at South Bank. And yeah, the G20 to push too big to fail bank bondholder bailouts. So what they've done initially is they've used all the taxpayer debt to run up, like nearly to $400 billion in costs. Now, if there's a second wave, what the intention is to do, like they've done in Greece, is to use the money in the bank holders' banks to bail the banks out. So if you had $1 in, if the bailout happened, next thing you knew, maybe you had 25 cents in the dollar. So they took it out to bail out the banks. There's plenty of information there too if you want to touch on that. Queenslanders may be forced to buy back. So we're saying Queensland's got nearly $86 billion worth of debt, which is $100 million a week in interest payments only. Sold off Queensland Rail, sold off Port of Brisbane, sold off Queensland timber plantations, sold off Queensland toll roads. Now, part of the agenda is, well, let's look at leasing it back. They're saying, well, you can lease it back, but at the end you probably have to buy it back again anyway. This reflects the inconsistency that happened with the social system and the justice in the world. Someone in the States sent to me this as well. This banker gets, he's misappropriation of fraud. What do we got? $3 billion, he gets a 40-month sentence. This guy, yeah, steals $100, feels guilty, takes it back, gets 15 years. 99% of us are good-hearted people who respect others and want peace. The other 1% rule the world and tell us we're at war. I just want to play this short video for you quickly, if I can, that highlights, it runs for about 4 minutes, talks about the background of Occupy and what transpired in Australia. Thanks.
Dear Americans, this July 4th, dream of insurrection against corporate rule. Occupy Wall Street. In mid-July, Counterculture magazine Adbusters follows its tweet with a call to action. Occupy Wall Street, September 17th. Bring tent. Anonymous throws its support behind Occupy, and the movement's momentum takes off via social media. Citizens travel from across the country to meet up with activists in New York as Mayor Michael Bloomberg prepares for a protest. 2,000 protesters descend on Lower Manhattan. The New York City Police Department blocks Wall Street, and the protesters move to Zuccotti Park, where a culture of consensus takes root. Protesters camp for the night and then for the week. Little does anyone know, the occupation is just beginning. Protesters received scant media coverage during the first week, but a few cans of pepper spray, an army of citizen journalists, and close to 1,000 arrests are about to change everything.
We saw in the video you being sort of surrounded and just sprayed in the face.
Police test boundaries and pile hundreds into paddy wagons, and the world begins to watch.
Occupy Wall Street. Occupy Wall Street.
Wall Street. Obviously, I've heard of it. I've seen it on television.
New Occupy camps form around the world. Everyone gets fed, and libraries flourish. People want to express themselves, says Bloomberg, and as long as they obey the laws, we allow them to. On October 15th, the so-called Day of Rage, impassioned citizens march in more than 80 cities around the world.
I'm down here at Post Office Square in Brisbane CBD, where a number of protesters have just been evicted. A handful of protesters chose to stay at Post Office Square and staged a sit-in before being forcibly evicted by police. 4 of the group, including Occupation Coordinator Paul Seils, were taken away in police vehicles, but 3 were later released without charge.
They're gonna wait for my train to come. They're gonna wait for my train to come. They're gonna wait for my train to come. No more breaking around. They're gonna wait for my train to come. They're gonna wait for my train to come. They're gonna wait for my train to come. No more breaking around. They're gonna wait for my train to come. They're gonna wait for my train to come. They're gonna wait for my train to come. No more breaking around. They're gonna wait for my train to come. They're gonna wait for my train to come. They're gonna wait for my train to come. No more breaking around. Now I don't know, but I've been told the green grass I'm gonna sing it till I'm old. I don't know, but I've been told green grass I'm gonna sing it till I'm old. Wait for my train to come. They're gonna wait for my train to come. They're gonna wait for my train to come. No more breaking around. They're gonna wait for my train to come. They're gonna wait for my train to come. They're gonna wait for my train to come. No more breaking around. Now I don't know, but I've been told the green grass I'm gonna sing it till I'm old. I don't know, but I've been told the green grass I'm gonna sing it till I'm old. I don't know.
Riot police deployed in Hong Kong Occupy Central movement to remove peaceful protesters. Tens of thousands of people rallied outside Hong Kong's government offices Saturday night in protest of Beijing's decision to rule out a fully democratic election in Hong Kong in 2017.
So we're evolving. We're still evolving. I thought I'd show you this image as well. This is typical of what happened. The app, off-grid application. So technology is evolving around the structure. This app was able to have people communicate to each other when all the networks and social media, etc., get shut down. Anti-protest laws passed in Victoria, Tasmania. Yeah, so it's time to organise. But rebellion's not necessarily what you think it is. And any way that you can do it in your way to contribute, please do. The only solution at this point in time is for us to individually and collectively encourage ourselves and others to raise our consciousness and frequency. Do no harm, but take no shit. I'll see you this afternoon. Thanks.
We need extraordinary human beings like Paul and Ian to champion the cause, don't we? You know, they get up at 4 a.m. to go to these protests, and you know, I think they deserve a really warm applause. Thanks, Paul.